I'm going to start by, I guess, introducing myself. I'm an Indigenous scholar. I grew up on the North Shore of Lake Superior in a little town called Marathon, Ontario. Most Canadians know this town because it's like one of 7 across Lake Superior, and you probably stop there for gas. Maybe you smelled our mill. We used to have a pulp and paper mill. Everyone always says, oh, I remember your mill. Growing up on the North Shore of Lake Superior was a really formative experience for me as a young person and as a young Native person in particular, because there have been really significant changes to the North Shore as a result of lots of different industrial developments, the pulp and paper industry and the gold mining industry as well. And so I went on to study geography. I'm a health geographer by training, and my work really focuses on the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the environments they live in, and looking at how changing environments influence health. So one of the things that I've learned in this kind of, I guess, the 10 years that I've been doing this is that the fundamental changes are happening at the Indigenous knowledge system level. So the purpose, I think, of this talk today is going to be to define and explore what Indigenous knowledge systems are, to describe some of the processes and outcomes of environmental dispossession which are happening and shaping Indigenous relationship with land today and historically, and then talk a little bit about the promising ways forward and the ways that Indigenous communities and scholars are engaging in research as a way of reconnecting with land in spite of the new places and spaces that they're occupying. So a good place to start is to talk about who Indigenous people are. And around the world, there are roughly 400 million Indigenous people. This is about 6% of the global population. And in contemporary times, Indigenous peoples are the descendants of original populations. So these are the populations that lived in places prior to the onset of colonization. They represent geographically and culturally contextualized places or populations, and the very identities of who Indigenous peoples are often very closely related to the lands and places that they have traditionally occupied. So this is Begeek-Dagong Anishinaabe, which is my community. So this is the meeting place of the rivers, the Black and the Pick rivers. And this river then meets the majestic Lake Superior. So we have been known as the people who live where the rivers meet in our traditional territory. So traditionally, Indigenous peoples have been known as, I guess, subsistence cultures, meaning that daily diet and nourishment comes from the resources of the lands and seas. And obviously, harvesting these resources is dependent on a very deep knowledge about local ecosystems and how to best manage ecosystems in a way that's going to sustain life for communities. And this can be referred to as an Indigenous knowledge system. So there aren't any commonly accepted definitions of what an Indigenous knowledge system is. However, there are various characteristics that are common regardless of the Indigenous population that you're looking at and regardless of what ecosystem we find them. And generally that is that it's a very localized knowledge that is dynamic, it's an applied knowledge, it's an integrated knowledge that's best learned by doing, right? So being out on the land collecting food, fishing, hunting, and so on. But it's also a knowledge that has a strong social, moral, and spiritual component to it. And this is where I think some of the differentiation around Indigenous knowledge system differs from biomedical systems or industrial thinking that I think many of us are more familiar with. So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to kind of demonstrate some of these characteristics through examples. So Indigenous knowledge systems are fundamentally supported by a spiritual dimension. And it's the spiritual realm that can be very challenging to describe because it's not a tangible object. It's not something that we can see and understand and feel in the same way we can other components like eating a healthy diet, knowing that we have a disease or not. Rather, it's based on a wider understanding that life, learning, and well-being are part of a larger system of fluid and connected pieces. And one of the ways that I've started to understand this is through learning the Anishinaabe-Moan language, which is my native language. So my mother is a fluent language speaker. On the slide, this is my grandmother, Adeline Michano. And she grew up speaking her language. Anishinaabe-Moan was her first language, and she didn't speak English until she was probably in her 20s. And the interesting thing about the Anishinaabe-Moan language is that philosophically there is no differentiation across gender lines like we understand in English. So there's no he or she. Rather, the differentiation is along animate and inanimate objects. And the differentiation between what's animate and inanimate is not necessarily something that's living or not, but it's something that has spirit, okay? And so obviously this is very difficult to quantify or to characterize or to describe because it's not necessarily something that you could see and understand in our Western way of understanding that is, you know, something that you would attribute to have life. So for example, a rock, you know, does have a spiritual being and is part of an animate, does have an animate being, okay? And so my grandmother growing up, she could never get gender right. So I always remember being referred to as he. Well, my male cousins were she. And I just kind of always thought like, oh, the crazy old lady just, you know, and I would be like 5, 6, 7, and we'd always kind of make fun of Granny. But that's where she came from, and that was her philosophy and her basis for understanding the world around her. And it came from someplace deeper. So it wasn't until I, you know, obviously I was like much later in life, and I was starting to kind of really dig deeper into the roots of Indigenous knowledge systems and understanding the important role that this spiritual dimension plays in understanding languages and how they are tied to these dimensions that I have not been capable of understanding yet. So these conceptual ideas stem in large part from Anishinaabe ideas of creation, meaning where we come from, which persist only in the oral tradition, or often only in the oral tradition. It's very hard to find writings about the things that I'm talking about right now, and much of the knowledge that I'm presenting here today comes from oral history work and work with elders over the last decade. And these oral traditions conceptualize human life as deeply connected to various parts of the physical world, including non-living objects like I talked about. And these distinctions are deeply rooted in Anishinaabe spiritual beliefs, including a relatedness that generally does not differentiate between the physical and spiritual worlds. And so a lot of Anishinaabe artists and other Indigenous artists in Canada and around the world have depicted kind of this interrelated nature between humans, the land, resources, and non-living objects as connected. And I think this is one of the best ways that we can sort of conceptualize this connectedness in a pragmatic, kind of tangible way. Probably the most important dimension of the Indigenous knowledge system is that it's shared almost exclusively within that oral tradition. And to learn and be part of the Indigenous knowledge system means that you have to practice and live that knowledge. So in practical terms, accumulating this knowledge is based fundamentally on relating to the land, so being out on the land and having opportunities to harvest, to fish, to share your knowledge, but also to have access to the people that have that knowledge, right? So it's not enough to be out alone, but also to be out sharing that knowledge. Some knowledges are rooted strongly in daily life, and obviously just the fundamental needs to survive, so finding foods, you know, being able to, say, build shelter, to find firewood, to find water in the Australian outback, or to build an igloo, you know, in the Arctic. But other knowledges are deeper and have much more spiritual meaning and are not just the everyday knowledges. So some of these are based on or are accessible only through, say, ceremony, obligation, or inheritance. So for example, in the role that traditional healers play in our communities, or for example, in the roles that, say, our midwives play, and the traditional knowledge that they have and the gifts that they are given, right? So another important dimension of the Indigenous knowledge system is that it relies on a relational context, which means that there's a strong social and moral rules, and that one has obligations not only to themselves, but also to their wider community and to their greater ecosystem. So in the Nunavut region of Canada's Arctic region, there's a specialized health concept called IQ. It's a long Inuit word that I'm not going to try to pronounce right now. And this worldview recognizes that human connection to land and to greater ecosystems and to one another is fundamentally important for the health of individuals and well-being generally. So at the individual level, being a good or moral person, which is something that you strive to be, can be conceived of as inumeric, which is a most genuine person. And in the Inuit, in Inuit life and social structure, this concept of sharing and being a generous person is something that is highly regarded. Among Native Hawaiians, the meaning of a good or healthy person involves values that extend much beyond the individual level. Okay, so it's not just about me having health and feeling good today, but it's about living in balance with others in the ecosystem, doing the right thing, and working without expecting reward. So these are really interesting ways of understanding social obligations and learning how individual wellness is about strengthening and protecting family and community and extends far beyond individuals. So precisely because of these very close ties and intimate ties with the land, processes of environmental dispossession and colonialism have had really devastating consequences for Indigenous communities, and they are a common unifying experience among Indigenous peoples globally. Environmental dispossession refers to the processes by which Indigenous peoples' access to their traditional lands and territories is reduced or eliminated. And they occur in various different ways. They're not only historic, they continue to occur today. And the goals and outcomes of these processes can vary very widely across place and culture. And direct forms of environmental dispossession involve processes that physically disable communities from accessing their traditional territories. So this could be a landslide, it could be a clear-cut forest, like I've shown on the slide. But it could be more subtle processes such as, say, contamination of a river, which means that you can no longer use that river and eat fish from it, for example. And then there are indirect forms of dispossession, which occur as a result of policies, regulation, or development, whose intent is to sever Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous peoples from their lands and traditional territories. And probably the most devastating and well-known example would be the Indian residential schools, which was a direct result of the Indian Act. It's the only race-based legislation that continues or exists in Canada today, developed in 1876, essentially to assimilate the Aboriginal population of Canada, and based on assumptions that Indigenous peoples were inferior, unequal, and needing assimilation. So for over 100 years, 150,000 Aboriginal children were taken from their homes forcibly and put into residential schools, such as that one shown on the slide. I think this is a really important photo because it demonstrates, obviously, the devastation of parents who were so sad and so devastated by the residential school system that they wouldn't leave their kids. So on a global level, processes of environmental dispossession, whether they're operating in direct or indirect forms, have had significant impacts for Indigenous way of life because they destabilize Indigenous knowledge systems, which are fundamental for Indigenous way of life. And they do so by reducing Indigenous people's confidence in environmental conditions. And while we know that Indigenous knowledge systems are dynamic and constantly changing, unfortunately, processes of environmental dispossession can accelerate changes in natural systems, the natural changes that we see in environmental systems, to such an extent that Indigenous peoples no longer know how to predict them. So we know that weather patterns change, animals migrate, and so on, but the changes that we're seeing are so rapid in Indigenous communities, because of climate change and forms of industrial development, that Indigenous peoples no longer have that inherent understanding and knowledge. And because people are not, are losing access to the places and spaces that they've once known so well, they're not spending social time out as well. So this is kind of the fundamental basis for change in way of life in many Indigenous communities today. Across Indigenous peoples globally, the experience of colonization and environmental dispossession are at the root of Indigenous health equity that we see today. So contemporary patterns of Indigenous health equity can be explained by these processes of change happening in Indigenous communities. And we see patterns of health, mortality, and morbidity that are very similar among Indigenous communities, regardless of where we're looking, okay? So generally, Indigenous peoples are sicker, they die earlier, and they're poorer than non-Indigenous peoples. And while we have seen considerable gains in the health status of Indigenous people, so for example, in life expectancy and reductions in infant mortality, we're still seeing persistence of infectious disease, the growth of long-term chronic diseases like type 2 diabetes, for example, and very unequal access to social determinants of health. So we see unprecedented levels of poverty, unemployment, education, and these are really important markers of inequality in our Indigenous communities. And another important shift that we're seeing as a result of these processes of environmental dispossession and changing access to traditional lands and territories is a very unprecedented shift of Indigenous peoples into cities. So in Canada today, greater than half of our population lives in cities. In the Maori context of New Zealand, 87% are urban. And while I think the processes that are changing and leading this very urbanizing population are led by overwhelmingly negative and forced policies, the outcomes are not always bad. So we are seeing a lot of marginalization and homelessness and so on extended into cities, but at the same time we're seeing the development of new cultures, new identities, and new forms of indigenization, which is actually a little bit exciting. So this may be a photo that some of you will have seen. This is the Idle No More movement that started in 2012, in the fall of 2012. And Idle No More was a movement that was created by 4 women in Saskatchewan. And it was resisting impending environmental regulation that was going to significantly change Indigenous relationships with land and also environmental protection in Canada. And so this movement, Idle No More, began as like a series of kind of teach-ins. That's what they were calling them. So, these women were visiting places and talking about Indigenous rights, unequal access to legal processes to kind of fight impending regulation like Bill C-45, the pipelines, the fact that so many First Nation communities today don't have safe drinking water. And a lot, I think, of the large-scale systemic and ongoing issues that create contemporary inequity in the Indigenous context. So this little group of women, strong, amazing women, this process quickly evolved into something that became a national movement. And it extended across the country. There was a giant social media campaign, and it was really exciting because it was youth-driven. And we saw marches like this across Canada and globally. And it was a very exciting time because the root of this movement was the need for increased discussion and public education about Indigenous land issues, and a general desire to create public spaces for Indigenous people to talk about their environmental futures and ability to express their Indigenous rights to land, which have been severely marginalized by political processes in Canada. So in the next little while, one of the places that I'm moving is to kind of redefine Indigenous relationship to land and to talk about environmental repossession efforts. So I've spent a lot of time talking about environmental dispossession and how horrible these processes are. And we need to understand them because they are systemic, they are political, and they are large scale. But I think that moving forward, we need to start thinking about the promising solutions that Indigenous peoples are a part of so that we can frame inequity not just as an Indigenous issue, but as a Canadian issue. So we introduced this concept of environmental repossession as a theoretical construct for exploring the social, cultural, and political processes by which Indigenous peoples and communities are expressing and asserting their rights to land. And I think one of the general assumptions about Indigenous peoples in Canada and worldwide is that they are generally remote and isolated peoples and that they're land-based. And I think that is has been true in the past, but because of what I've told you and the ways that Indigenous peoples are now represented overwhelmingly in cities, there's a need to be understanding this new relationship with land and what Indigenous rights look like in contemporary times. So in spite of the promise of the Idle No More movement, for example, as a site or a space for exploring or defining this concept of environmental repossession, I think there's a really important point to be made that not all environmental repossessions have to occur by marching through the streets, by protesting, by blocking roads and so on. There are lots of different spaces and places and ways for us to be doing this. And that's where I really want to move in the next little while. So along with colleagues from New Zealand and Hawaii, we're really interested in exploring what environmental repossession can look like across multiple geographic scales with Indigenous communities in different places. And there are a lot of places where Indigenous peoples are continuing to struggle, like the 30-meter telescope, which has been proposed for many years and still is not constructed. But also, I think, proposing the idea that Indigenous peoples can have strong relationships to land and can promote their Indigenous knowledge systems in cities, for example, through a food sovereignty movement. So this is something that we're thinking about exploring in the city of Auckland. So I think I'm going to stop there and just thank you all very much for listening, and that's me. Thank you.
Those are great presentations. I just wanted to ask Chantelle a question, if I can remember it correctly now. So you're talking about the link to the land, and I was thinking about the diversity of First Nation, Métis, Inuit people, and even non-status First Nations, and how, I think those are really great ideas, especially around food sovereignty, but for some, for some communities, they don't have a link to the land. They won't have land-based, they won't be able to be land-based, even for Métis communities. So I was wondering your thoughts around that, because I was thinking in some of the work that I do, I think more around reclamation of identity, reclaiming traditional roles, as you were talking about, gender. I was thinking about that because I have Anishinaabe ancestry as well, and I was thinking, are there other ways to maybe connect those ideas? Just thinking, a little more broadly about that. Definitely. And thank you so much for a great presentation.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think that I have, as a geographer and someone who's really, I'm from Northern Ontario, so my first and most formative experiences have been on Lake Superior. And my own experiences as a person who did not live on reserve, right, as a result of lots of complicated things. Anyway, so I have this unique kind of history, and as I kind of had my experiences learning through university, have come to be an urban person. And suddenly I realized that the ways that I'm going to learn Indigenous knowledge and practice and teach to my kids is very different than, say, my sisters who do live in Northern Ontario and have access to elders and people and that land base. And so I guess this idea of repossession has some assumptions built into it that we may not necessarily have access to land in that same way. But it's okay, because the representations and places where we are going to be creating these new forms of indigeneity is not necessarily the same as in the past. And I think that's something that really needs to be talked about in Canada, because I think we have really old ideas about who Indigenous people are, not just in Canada, but globally. And so I think, obviously, I don't even know what the percentage is of contested land and the ways that treaties are the contested land claim issue is hot. It's a hot topic, right? But for lots of different reasons, we are now a really urbanized population. And it doesn't mean that we don't have room and space to be exploring our Indigenous knowledge systems, but in new ways. And so I think that there's political, economic, cultural ways, and that's those are promising places, but I think it's really it's unexplored. And I think to the detriment, because I think that we find a lot of kids, Indigenous kids, who are living in cities and don't know where their place is. And it's really sad. So that's why I'm hoping that we can explore that a bit more so that everybody knows where they belong.
Okay. Thanks. Yes, I've got a question for Patrick about photosynthesis. So I appreciate that you want to do it better than nature, but shouldn't the first step be to actually mimic nature and actually get some photosynthetic PV? Ever since I've read Ian McEwan's Solar, I guess, why aren't we doing this yet? What's actually stopping us from just grinding up blue currents, as you say, in a massively big scale and actually using it in a proper way?
Okay, I mean, that's a good question. Probably the thing that I didn't mention at all was, you'll see why, was that these molecules that I'm talking about will never be used in real solar cells, okay? Never. They are outstandingly difficult to make. Really, they're kind of pinnacle of synthetic chemistry. You can make fractions of grams, milligrams, over month periods. Okay, so it really is a project of understanding at this stage, because we're never going to make these molecules. It's about what do we need to understand about this to make our own ones. So that I wouldn't say I glossed over it, but the purpose isn't to make something in this project. What you're saying, of course, is really interesting, and actually the diversity. I mean, it was mentioned in a talk yesterday about the diversity of what's required in terms of generating energy from light, from people using pure just bacteria to create chemical energy. And people do this for even going to things like hydroponics. You need to define your problem and use the right solution to the right problem. So I think to get back to your kind of specific question, can we just take nature and use it to generate energy? It's not typically, at least in my awareness, it tends not to be so easy to directly extract it, and you do have to make changes. Also, a lot of biological proteins work very well in biological environments or physiological conditions, and that's not normally the same conditions you want to run a solar cell under. No, I hope that.
Okay.
I also have a question for Patrick. So when you show these rings and you say the words localization and delocalization, all quantum physicists will get really excited and think the thing you should be doing is putting a magnetic field through that ring somehow to turn localization and delocalization on and off. Do you look at this, or does anyone in your community?
So those exact molecules have been studied on this thing, and it's exceedingly difficult.
Okay.
Very fun. Yeah. I can talk to you after. It's one of these things that you would think you would see something really interesting. You actually have to basically put a charge on them permanently. So you have to dope them, and then they only last for a few hours. So you have a chemical problem. And then you have to run them at low temperature, and then you have to put them in a superconducting magnet, and it just becomes this kind of snowball effect of experimental horror.
So I thought I'd try to put a bridging question in here amongst this kind of very divergent, which I appreciate that there's a broad breadth to this panel. But I'm kind of curious about, one of the reasons we really worry about diversity in STEM is that we're worried about diversity of ideas. So ideas where things come from, different use cases that might come out of the technology. We see things like genetically modified foods in different cultures approaching that very differently as to the acceptability of that. And so I'm kind of interested in starting with Chantelle, kind of trying to get a sense of how do you see some of these indigenous cultures in their, maybe not education, but their attempts to actually become parts of some of these scientific cultures, to bring in those ideas and maybe bring them back, or to tie them back in, and then kind of going maybe to the other panel to get a sense of how they feel that's actually happening or not.
I think that's a really great question, and I think it's something that's necessary and important for I think our economies, the global economy really, because I think that Indigenous peoples have been relatively excluded from the scientific community because our sciences are oral for the most part. And you know, the very nature of Indigenous knowledge systems means that we're not going to find a lot about this information in published scientific papers, because it's knowledge that people are meant to know when they're meant to know it. So that's one part of the question. So we're talking about different forms of knowledge and the ways that you learn these knowledges, but also because Indigenous peoples have been relatively, I think, marginalized from traditional, and have not had equal access and opportunity to learn, you know, STEM or engineering. Even when our kids get into universities, they're traditionally kind of like pushed into First Nation studies, into social work, to go back to their communities and help in ways that are often crisis-driven. And I mean, there's like this really important revolution, I think, happening through the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, which has wonderfully funded, I think, myself, maybe Carrie, and developed this amazing group of young scholars who are leading the charge on Indigenous health and Indigenous health research. And it's starting to cross boundaries. And I think developing models of learning and success that are not just focused on Native studies, okay? And at Western, one of the very exciting developments has been the creation of this new interdisciplinary initiative in applied Indigenous scholarship. So there are a couple of really important, I think, political contexts for that. The first is that Western's in the process of creating our first ever Indigenous strategic plan, which is awesome. But also because we are trying to respond to the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was a multi-year commission into understanding the impacts of the residential school systems, which I talked about. And so there were a number of calls to action that were dedicated specifically for post-secondary educations and for the funding agencies. And part of that was to create more opportunities for Indigenous learners in our institutions and to make them more widely available and accessible and appealing options, so that we don't just see, you know, Indigenous kids who get to university and choose these same options, but that they choose engineering and that they choose medical sciences and wide places. And I think there's a real opportunity for all of us to be a part of that, so that we can all see a role for ourselves in making our universities much more inclusive places for Indigenous learners and non-Indigenous learners. Because as we push forward in reconciliation in Canada, we're not just talking about making our country better for Indigenous people, it's for everybody, right? As soon as we start to, I think, reduce those inequalities that we see in Indigenous communities, we're all going to benefit. So I think that is a really great question, and I think that promoting interdisciplinarity for Indigenous ideas broadly, there's a real promise there.
Okay. Any other questions? Richard?
Did you want to respond?
Sorry, Patrick, did you want to come in on that? One sec.
Only because I feel I ought to. But actually, no, I mean, I find that this is coming from physics, you know. In many ways, physicists tend to think of themselves as having a monoculture. You know, there is one way of doing things and we do it this way, and it actually doesn't matter who you are or where you come from as long as you do it the way we do it. You know, I don't think that's true. That's what we'd like to think. But I was very interested with your answer, and actually to the extent at which we all need to try and understand how much we can gain by aligning the interests to try not to compartmentalize, because I think things tend to work better when we say, well, actually, you know, if we're, as a university, if we take the best people from anywhere, whoever they are, whatever language they speak, whatever culture they're from, we all gain. And whether you can do that without losing some of your culture is something that, I mean, it's outside physics, so I don't know. It's beyond my experience, but I thought it was a very interesting answer.
Okay, so I'm going to put a view forward which isn't necessarily my own, but it relates to something that Patrick's been talking about. It's in photosynthesis. So nature isn't greedy in how it uses photons, right? So a tree will take up to 100 years to grow, and then we can take that tree, we can burn it and get the energy back in a very short amount of time. And what that shows is that it's actually not very efficient. So nature is sort of 3 to 6% efficient for photosynthesis. The best thing nature can do is kind of sugarcane, which is up to about 11% efficient. So if we're going to try and use nature, we're not going to do very well. I mean, we have silicon solar cells, which work at 20% and are much cheaper to produce than a field full of planting trees, for example, from an economic point of view. Of course, when a tree grows, it doesn't just create energy and store it for us, it supports the whole ecosystem. Right? And that's valuable in itself as a separate thing. So, two questions. One, is trying to learn from nature in terms of photosynthesis actually going to get us where we need to be for our energy demands as society? B, what about genetic modification? Should we be modifying nature to make it more efficient? Right? This is a controversial question I'm putting out here. And how do we also then deal with the fact that nature's also had millions of years to evolve, and it's kind of got to what you'd think would be an optimum point. So can it get any better, fundamentally? So just some thoughts there for people to try and think about and discuss.
Maybe I could dive in with the first part and then open the hard bit up to others. But you're saying about, what can we learn? I mean, is this the right thing to do, to be learning from nature? And I think I kind of made the point a little bit earlier that you're absolutely right. Nature is very, very good at doing what it wants to do. That doesn't necessarily, that's not what we want it to do. In a way, I do feel, although I have couched all my work in terms of photosynthesis, you can probably imagine it's to an extent, it is fundamental research about understanding. And I appreciate the point you make that actually we would have a long way to go if we tried to really adapt. We can do better using entirely synthetic silicon cells, or many of the other techniques that have been spoken about yesterday. In terms of, your second question was, should we modify nature?
Yeah, so nature is, we know it's quite inefficient. We have these great tools now. We have genetic modification, etc. As mentioned yesterday. Where are we as a society in terms of if we know we can improve the efficiency of nature growing, which might therefore make crop yields higher. You know, is that something, so that's just converting energy right, into another source. Is that something we should be doing as a society? How do we address that issue? It's a more general discussion.
Which one of you want to take that one on?
Well, I think when it comes to energy production and light harvesting in particular, and we'll leave genetic modification for a second, but I think there's more to it than just raw internal quantum yields and stuff like this, right? And there's the ideas around product cycle, so cradle to grave analogies, recycling the materials, green chemistry. There's all these other things rather that play an important role, I think, on the justification between one type of device versus another. And of course, application plays into that as well. But so in some cases, if you can get something really cheap that only has 6% or 11% efficiency versus something that they put into outer space that reuses rare earth metals that cost $1 billion for that much, you know, I think there's some play between those two that can be found. And engineers should probably get into that, I guess. With respects to genetic modification, and I guess this sort of comes back to food as well. I was raised on a farm, and so my grandfather built his cattle herd literally from his dad, right? And his son took it over. That cattle herd was around for 100 years, roughly. And they selectively bred cows, right? They actually genetically modified their food and other things. So I'm not against genetic modification. The problem, I guess, with genetic modification that we should be worried about is the unintended consequences. So, and when it comes to genetically modifying bacteria or cyanobacteria to increase their light harvesting capabilities or to try to disrupt and maybe optimize light harvesting abilities, will we create a super cyanobacteria that takes over the world and kills us all and becomes the dominant species? I don't know, but that's my answer from a bioengineer's perspective. Thank you guys, by the way.
I mean, one of the things is I thought about during these talks is how we're mimicking nature ourselves, but how much does nature respond to the impact of human technological advances? So, you know, there's a two-way process here. So, as humans as we've gone on and pushed the technological boundary, I mean, how much is nature sort of starting to mimic us in certain ways? I know it's very difficult to measure many things over short length times, but do you know if there's any? Well, this is just me talking to myself. I'm not sure if anyone else will.
So I guess maybe what I'm getting from what your question is you know, these microbes do more than just harvest light, right? They store energy in chemical form. They obviously live, they replicate, et cetera, et cetera. And so I know like people are trying to use them as carbon capture mechanisms and things like that, if that's what you're driving at. So there is sort of a feedback between, you know, pollution and growth of molecule or of elements.
I think one of the things is, you know, we sort of put infrastructure in places that are now seeing colonization of species onto them, you know, that aren't naturally found in their environment. So how they're sort of, how they're reacting back to what we impact on them. That was the sort of point I was trying to get at. But again, it's just something that's going around in my head and everyone's looking at me blankly. So I will keep passing the box around. Do you want to just take it down there? Yep. Catch.
Okay, so this might be controversial, and also I'm not a scientist, I'm a humanist. But something that's striking me, I thought was great, the question about what the bridging question between the papers, but something sort of fundamental is striking me, which is this discussion about us and nature. as though we weren't nature. And I think Chantelle's presentation sort of underscores the fact that Indigenous knowledge understands us as nature, or as playing an integral role in nature, or being deeply connected to it. And so I guess I just wanted to hear people's thoughts about that sort of bifurcation between humans as sort of separate, the masters of all, the center of the universe, and consciousness and reason and all of these things, which I believe in, but also understand that old sort of Cartesian notion has been challenged, but also needs to be challenged, I think. That would be my claim. And I think, so when we talk about Indigenous knowledge, it's not just bringing Indigenous kids into the academy and teaching them how to be scientists. It's about scientists going to Indigenous communities and learning from Indigenous knowledge. So I just wondered if people had thoughts about that.
Yeah, who wants to? Patrick?
I completely agree with your question. And actually, I realized through my talk that the language I would use about nature, take, learn, or not even learn, take, mimic, steal, exploit. Right, that's the language that is used. And it's not, okay, I'm not saying, we're going to kill a load of animals and grind them up and stuff, but it is, there is a certain exploitative nature to looking at what nature does well and taking one aspect of that for something we want without a realization, and the point has been made that actually, trees grow slowly for a reason. If trees were 100% efficient, they'd grow in hardly any time, and they don't. And that isn't a question that I'm asking. I'm asking what's the best we can do. So, I would certainly agree that it's not something that's rewarded necessarily in physics, my own field, to think about that. And it's certainly not something that if you said to, in a grant proposal, I want to do something that's more in tune with nature and less focused on absolute efficiency, it would be possibly a challenge to get that funded. Possibly, I couldn't say.
I think one of the obviously one of the big challenges is that we are academics, right? And our, precisely what you're pointing out is that we are in this system where we've got to produce really quickly, and unfortunately, there's not often time to think about things that aren't directly related to your discipline. And I think what Carrie was trying to talk about yesterday, what you did talk about, is the nature and role of communities and Indigenous communities in guiding research. So this is one really new and exciting area, I think, of research happening in Canada that is gaining recognition and is going to gain, I think, a lot more recognition post TRC and so on by the federal granting agencies, is the role and responsibility for us to be thinking about the human dimensions of the work that we do, right? And that placing Indigenous communities, for example, in research is very important. So we held a panel last week and talked about our positionalities. So it was an interdisciplinary panel, and we're talking about the role for the disciplines in Indigenous research. And we had a biologist on board, and he's amazing because he's the sort of guy who's very interested in mercury in the environment, but is completely guided by his community partners. And unfortunately for him, he's working in NSERC and, the Natural Sciences and Engineering's research, right, which doesn't necessarily allow for the development of community relationships within a 5-year research plan, right? So we're often not afforded the ability to do those sorts of things so that we can accurately incorporate human dimensions into the applied nature of the work that we're doing. And I mean, the work that you all talked about yesterday, I was just sitting there and so confused, but also enlightened, because I'm thinking about, the pharmaceutical industry and thinking about mice and pushing buttons and thinking about how does this relate into everyday context. And it all has important applications, but oftentimes we don't have the opportunities, I think, to bring this back to that human level. And I don't really know how we're going to get there, but I think it's one of the big challenges for us is to learn how to disseminate, and not just, it shouldn't happen just at the end of the research, but at the beginning, right? So how are we doing stuff that actually matters for overcoming the big challenges that we see?
I guess, if you don't mind, I'd like to
no, please.
Yeah, I was challenged with this. I was a scientific advisor to curriculum development for K-12 in Alberta. And this idea of being able to communicate, like you were saying, Patrick, really came up. We were building basically mini labs, nanotech labs that kids could do in school to illustrate some different phenomena. And anyway, the point is one of the people who was hired to actually develop the lab and actually put all the pieces together mentioned trying to incorporate Indigenous nomenclature into it. And it really challenged me individually because I thought it was totally a different realm of thought, right? Like, I could not really wrap my brain around what this person was trying to say to me about we were talking about microfluidic chambers and molecules and about the spirit of that. And this other person was trying to talk about the spirit of these devices and how to convey that in an Indigenous context, which I think is what you're asking, right? And I found it, as a scientist, very confusing, personally, and challenging. And it took multiple conversations to sort of come at this discussion intelligently. Yeah.
Okay, just one question, just down there. Oh.
Thank you. I realize this is a science meeting, and some of us are social scientists, and we don't have linguists, for example, here, and I am not a linguist. But I'm struck by the languages we use. I recall a time, I've done some fieldwork in the Canadian Arctic, for example, and I realized after a full week of fieldwork that I asked 4 distinct questions in my mind, and the way they were translated in Inuktitut was always the same question, because there was only one word for all of that until my community partner pulled me aside and said, you know, we just use pollution for all of that. We actually use the word bleach because that's our closest analog. And then I hear Patrick talking about his reflection on his language of exploiting nature, and Chantelle's challenges with a grandmother who learned to speak English. And then you talk about bringing indigeneity to urban areas. Does your language now have to evolve to work with the scientific community and with this evolution of Indigenous knowledge and indigeneity itself? And if so, how? What guides that, or is it an organic process?
It's a really, it's a great question, and I don't really know is the answer. I think part of, so you're a geographer and I'm a geographer, so we understand each other, right? And geographers are pretty awesome because they seem to know a lot about a lot. I think we are like masters of all trades sometimes, or masters of, I don't even know how that works, so I'm going to stop now. But I think one of the greatest skills that I have is a social skill and ability to kind of talk to people regardless of where I am, which I can attribute to my mom, because she's my greatest teacher, but she is also very, she's like lights up the room. She's so bubbly and wonderful and knows how to talk to anybody and always makes friends. And this is, I think, one of the things that has guided me is that I know what I don't know, and am not afraid to ask questions, but know that I have to ask them in a responsible and respectful way. And I think that guiding, being led by that assumption means that I won't be offensive. Because I think that, well, hopefully not offensive, but I think that the ways that Indigenous peoples are changing and reflecting the new situations that we're in is very tricky, right? And I mean, when we talk about what people are, who they are, how they identify, who belongs where, it's really contested issue. Because, I mean, Indigenous identity is a very complicated thing because it is a reflection of this silly political structure that has basically been imposed. So I think that people know who they are, and I think that you ask them to define what they think is important, and that's the best way to go about it. Does that answer your question?
Just, yes.
Mine is more a comment in listening to both the scientists and the social science aspects of it. One thing that has irritated me for 40 years as a biology professor is undergraduates that say things like plants, animals, and humans. And this is really one of the basic problems that we have, is in our educational system from a very early age, we don't teach our children that they are part of nature and they are an animal, whether they like it or not, in the true biological sense. And if we understood that a lot better, I think we would have a lot less problems and people would move forward on it in a much easier way if they accepted we are part of the system and what we do to the system will bounce back at us, and so we need to respect it. I mean, we have to move forward, but we move forward in a way that takes into account the ecosystem. But it means education from grade K, you mentioned it, from kindergarten up, that we are part of it, we are not separate from it.
So I'm not going to say anything as profound as him. The first point, I just would like to point out to Patrick that in the book Gulliver's Travels, that in the part that people don't usually read because it's the 5th book or something, that Gulliver visits a research institute where they are trying to distill the essence of cucumbers to bring the sunlight to winter. And this was a direct satire of the Royal Society. So you can see you're working in a good historical context. I feel that Chantelle's point about language is something that is far more generic than the problems of Canada, because there are a huge number of minority languages, I think about half the languages in the world, that are in the process of dying out. And you can see already Chantelle is not a native speaker of her own language. And the problem is that there may be things that in the small number of languages we have left, French, German, English, Chinese, we may not be able to think about certain thoughts. If you imagine the situation reversed, that Chantelle's language was an ascendancy and French and English was dying out, the whole concept of gender would disappear, which would make whole areas of science much more difficult to do. And I suspect, but I don't know, that in these indigenous languages, they will have words for certain things, say in animal behavior and so on, which we don't have words to differentiate. As you know, that in some languages they have more words for colors than in others. So Russians can distinguish between light blue and dark blue better than the English, who it's all blue to. And so I just think that as well as looking at this problem from the point of view of the moral problem of the disadvantaged indigenous people, which clearly has to be addressed, we should also look at it at the huge opportunity for everybody to get some of the thoughts from these languages so that science can move forward. Because I think if you also put on a positive spin, everybody can see the advantage, rather than putting on the moral spin, you've been dreadful, now you've got to do something, which will tend, because of human nature, to produce a backlash and may not achieve what we really want, and make the indigenous people feel they have something to contribute towards the future, rather than just rectifying the injustices of the past.
To follow up on that, anyone?
So, catch?
I just wanted to follow up on Jeremy's point about being part of nature and what Chantelle was saying. Like when my cookum is giving teachings, my grandmother, she says there's two-leggeds, there's four-leggeds, right? There's the ones that swim, right? And there's ones with wings. So I think that's a really important point. And it goes to the idea that the two-leggeds were the last ones put on the earth, so we're the least important. And it's sort of a good teaching that when we think about, she always says, you know, if you want to think about it, Mother Earth doesn't really need the two-leggeds. And so if you want to think about, you know, preserving Mother Earth and being kind to Mother Earth, remember that Mother Earth can survive without us, right? And so just being aware and being cautious of walking softly on Mother Earth, being kind to Mother Earth. And you think about an ecosystem, you know, thinking about we are part of Mother Earth, we're part of that ecosystem, and you know, that's how I'm trying to raise my children as well, that we are two-leggeds, but also Mother Earth doesn't need us. So I just wanted to add that. Language.
Okay.